Questions from comments?
Okay, I had a question. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between those kind of state-driven research in the 60s with maybe other countries? I'm thinking of France. You know, I think Pompidou opened with a lab, basically, or a research center devoted to sound. So what were the connection? What were the...
Very strong. I mean, I'm always slightly cautious about East-West because it ends up being kind of comparative in a particular way. But when you look at who recorded in the experimental studio of Polish radio or who was involved in that musical culture, there's large numbers of Western Europeans, and there's a kind of sense in which these experimental studios form little islands of exceptionalism that connect with other islands, and the Cold War geographies don't seem to count too much. You know, they're equipped often with Western technologies. Musicians seem to be able to move back and forth. And they don't attract a great deal of attention from the state. The state seems to be prepared to let them thrive, perhaps because they offer some kind of sense of sort of demonstrable internationalism. We're there with our equivalents in Paris and so on. So
do they share technologies? Or?
Well, I don't think there's too much technology going from Eastern Europe to the West, if I'm honest. They were very keen on German technology in particular, as you can imagine. But they certainly share experiences. And from a British perspective, I mean, Cornelius Cardew was working there, which is extraordinary. John Tilbury, Hugh Davies, really very significant figures. So there's a kind of space of internationalism despite the Cold War, which is really striking.
Now, I'm just curious about the word experimental or experimentalist and so on. Once I was with Jonas Mikas and the curator from Denmark, and she used the word experimental film, and Jonas hit the ceiling.
Really?
He said, I'm not an experimentalist. I know what I'm doing. I do precisely what I want. And so I wonder about this. Don't they know what they want? They've arrived at something and then present it?
And his answer there is to behave much more like a scientist. I know what I'm doing and I know what I want. It's something like the scientific method, isn't it? I mean, I think this sense in Eastern Europe that this was a convenient flag is quite a strong one, because you know that if the state is making claims that we need to invest in experiment, if you can demonstrably be an experimenter, this is quite a useful thing. Whether this then manifests itself as a kind of ideology or a kind of position, I think is probably another question.
Maybe the process, but when you get to this state, isn't that a kind of a composition they've arrived at? So it's no longer experimental, it's what they want to do.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that, for sure. Yeah.
Have you come across any testimony or spoken to artists who have affirmed that is their intention, the use of the term experimental in that sense?
I think that's quite a difficult question to ask somebody, because you're sort of implying that they were having rather cosy, comfortable relations with the state. I mean, it's quite striking that a lot of these figures were party members. The person I started off with, Janne, the composer, who was also the filmmaker, he was a party member, but there's nothing in his work that would suggest he's a kind of ideological loyalist. I think probably this was about securing resources that wouldn't otherwise be available. Kotelin Loddick was also quite close to the state until she got thrown out for immorality by performing naked. So,
Isn't also, I think that there was something really a support of the state to the experiment in a way, because I'm thinking in Yugoslavia, for example, from Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, there was a whole organization for 46 which was called Popular Technique, Narodna Tehnika, and it was actually financing all the experimental cine clubs, all the courses for photography and so on. And I know, talking, for example, with some of the film directors, and here I'm going to film, the way of being experimental for them, it was also kind of a safe label, and it was also a way to say, okay, we are not doing conventional films, for example. So what was conventional with all those partisans film? So was also a way, then they founded, for example, Genre Experimental Film Festival, but it was also a way to have a certain distance from what was official, even it was financed and it was created within the official framework, which was approved and financed by the state. But this was really a way to find other way of languages and then connect it with the foreigners. And I think particularly art, music, maybe even more than film, was always left a bit more free, also in a way.
Yeah, I think the pattern you're describing would describe really the whole of Eastern Europe. It might be very pronounced in Yugoslavia. Yeah. It's there across the board.
And I know, for example, they would told me that if they would have a prize for a film for someone who was considered experimental, they would be much more proud than if they have it for example, some well-known or already a knowledge film director.
Very good. So that's your testimony.
Well, no, I know. It's just an...
Yeah, no. And for example, and they were highly inspired by John Smekas.
You should have heard him.
Yeah, but then they like also to call it underground, because he was like...
That's a little different.
Yeah, but so there was always this bit of how to define it. I think particularly in the 60s it came out, this idea of the experimental.
I use the word all the time, but it was kind of a revelation when he said that. And I said, you're right in a way. These are great artists, that we're looking at. And they arrived at these masterpieces. I mean, this woman who introduced us to was fantastic.
Yeah, there's really remarkable work. Sure.
I mean, first of all, this is fascinating material and really wonderful to learn more about, but it immediately kind of like opens question in 12 different directions or something, or 100 or so. And I mean, on one level I have a question how that slow transformation that you're describing from an interpretation of the experimental that is more grounded in the idea of what an experiment means, maybe in a laboratory environment where you kind of conduct something in search for a certain kind of knowledge production, towards something that I think substitutes maybe the experiment for something that we would call the critical, because in the beginning there seems to be criticality is not, at least not how we kind of casually or normally understand today, the primary instrument. And I was wondering how this relates to other fields of both scientific and cultural production around the same time. So how, I think on the one hand, and you touched on like cybernetics and other kind of technological advancements and discourses around at the same time, but how it, for instance, touches on, and I think especially in Poland it's very strong, fields of, say, science fiction literature and Stanisławem, and the kind of veiled criticality that is within those quasi-utopian narratives and discourses, and how I think in that push and pull, maybe we can come to a more complex reading of that.
Yeah. For the purposes of today, I haven't dwelled on this, but Stanisław Lem, the great science fiction writer, is running in the background of all of this. In 1964, he publishes a book called Summer Technology, and it's his predictions about, kind of long-term predictions about the future of the human body, about future consciousness, really. It's translated into Russian, into German, it's in Czech. It's only being translated to English this year for the first time. So it's a kind of remarkable part of the intellectual infrastructure of this generation of intellectuals that we don't really know enough about. If you read it in the Polish, it's fine. And it has remarkable connections. He talks about the disappearance of the voice. There's a whole chapter dedicated to the longer-term future of the voice in the era of electronics. And he says that we will no longer need voices when we have portable communication devices that we carry with us. So it's got all these kind of wonderful echoes of today. But a statement made in 1964 saying that we will no longer have the voice also has that kind of paracritical quality that you're talking about. So I think, yes, running alongside this, the science fiction story is absolutely vital. And whenever I've met any of these people, I'm interested in particularly their relationship with Lem, because for Vodichko, it's clearly highly, highly significant. It's a book that catalyzes his thinking.
Even if you go like a generation or two earlier to, I don't know, like Karl Čapek on one level, but like Huizinga and Homo Ludens on the other. And I mean, it's so interesting to see both on the level of architectural models and on the level of an idea of experience, relationships to 50s and 60s and situationism, and those kind of conversations about disorienting spaces.
But just to jump back to something else you said, I mean, what's very striking for me about this sort of shift over the period is there's a kind of mood change, which is quite hard to pin down, but the early works are so euphoric. They have this kind of sense that you will be liberated if you can have your senses stimulated. And of course, you look at architecture in the late 1950s, it's so strikingly the kind of case. But by 1970, it's very difficult to sustain that argument. Probably in Eastern Europe, almost impossible, for reasons I'm thinking of.
I'm curious about how, in the beginning, you were saying it was a really cacophonous show. And where would people have seen these works in the 60s? Like, could you go to a museum and see an exhibition of experimental music, or would...
I mean, there is striking that the experimental studio of Polish radio had its own regular weekly broadcast, where it was playing Stockhausen, it was playing the new music across the world. So there was a sort of public audience for that. But these artworks tend to be in the rather more limited spaces of galleries. Although this piece here, sorry, it's very poor quality, the image, because I've reduced it, but was in a gallery called Współczesne that you know fairly well, Magda, don't you? And it has a sort of quasi-official status. I mean, do you want to say a word or two about that?
So this was a gallery that was a part of KMPIK, so the Klub Prasy i Książki, which is a club for press and book, and it was a state-run as everything. Publishing house and also set a chain of stores in main cities, probably like in the main regional cities, so 49 of them. Where you would be able to buy foreign press. It was the only place where you could buy foreign press and foreign music. And it developed very specifically in just in Warsaw, this gallery that was officially run by this institution, but it was actually like author run. There was a few author galleries, that's what they called galerie autorskie, in Poland at the time, when one specific person, one individual would take up the management of such a gallery and would really decide on the program. And in this respect, this was Jan Bogucki, who is a critic and an art historian, curator, everything at once, with his wife Maria Bogucka. So together, starting in 1966, I think they actually opened 65 or 66, they run a one gallery show every month that lasts for 4 weeks. And the gallery is tiny. It's just one room in the foyer of a theater, of a great theater, National Theater in Warsaw. And the program is extremely interesting because it's on the one hand experiment with things like this, and they do not only show the Warsaw scene, they invite people like Rosołowicz had a show relatively early, I mean, during the first year. So people from Wrocław, people from Zielona Góra, so far west of Poland, people from Lublin, so really from various centers. At the same time, because they're operated in this network of the KMPIK, of this press club, they need to have shows like, the 30th, some anniversary of the October Revolution, when they would just show propaganda posters from the Soviet Union. So it's extremely eclectic and extremely interesting.
I have a related question. So when on the topic of experiments, so when people are saying they're experimenting, what exactly were they experimenting with? Like, did they consider themselves composers who are trying to experiment with a new form of music, or what did they consider this work as? Like, as sound art, as music? And then also for Magda, I learned that the score was really important as a record of these things created at the experimental studio.
Because it was published, right? That's what you mean, in the state music publishing house. Yeah.
Well, I think it would really depend from individual to individual. So maybe if we can just abstract a little bit. On the one hand, it's a rhetoric, isn't it? Say, I'm experimental at a time when you can pull down resources. But I think it's also to do with a kind of late modernist sensibility that says the social role of the artist is to somehow be anticipatory, is to be imagining other new forms of expression and so on. And this generation, up until that kind of crack in the late 60s, is fundamentally modernist and wholeheartedly enthusiastic about that, because they're this post-Stalinist generation that felt when art was put in the service of politics, it had been corrupted. Stalin had demanded these engineers of the human souls. And so for them, experimental is also a kind of code for a certain sort of autonomy or a certain sort of freedom, which I think is understandable.
I would like to know why you choose, and why is 1983? The period in between.
Yeah.
And how is all this history regarded today? Widely in the social context, in their social context, how it's widely socially regarded.
The last piece in the show is a collective actions work from 1983.
Well known.
Yeah, it's a piece that's from people know collective actions fairly well. Yeah, it's Monastirski and a kind of group of Russian intellectuals who are involved in effectively forms of self-surveillance, and so they would record photographically and in terms of sound all of their activities. So this piece that we showed followed a night through Moscow where they recorded their activities, and self-surveillance kind of interesting because it has these kind of echoes with the Vodichko piece where there's a degree of surveillance going on, all played out on his own individual body. So that's a very sort of functional logic for ending in 1983. In terms of I think that this work, unlike a lot of sound art, historically falls between kind of categories. So the musicologists have written about these studios, but have been very, very preoccupied with the musical pieces that emerge, and ignored the fact that these are really at the heart of a lot of kind of visual art practices. These places are particularly not really being explored by art historians either. So there's a kind of sense in which being between has allowed them to be kind of forgotten in a way. When we showed this show in Poland, it got a really extraordinarily positive response because it was people going, I didn't know this existed. And yet evidently the kind of quality and interest in the work warrants that attention. That's the case we're making anyway. I think that would be fair to say.
Don't you think that it's also a result in a way of the 90s, when somehow all the communist past was denied in a way, now in 1989? So suddenly everything that was happening in the 60s and 70s, there was like, it has this more like a communist connotation. So somehow in the 90s, there were a transitional period very much in negation of the past. So I think that then, particularly at the beginning of 2000, there is a kind of a step back and let's see everything, what happened, how it happened, and let's also break. I think this is particularly, I said it several times, like a younger generation of curators. Let's break like this dichotomy of the life of oppressed artists and state governing, and let's see exactly how things were happening and what was possible also to produce within the state infrastructure.
I think that's really true. The people who are doing the best work in Eastern Europe at the moment are all people who have very little personal or biographical connections, perhaps because they're free of the kind of value judgments that seem to lock down on those things. So
that triggers the question, to what extent do you see this material as typical of or as exceptional to the general kind of artistic or broader cultural context of the time? Are there questions explored here that weren't possible to be explored in any other artistic medium or cultural medium? Or is this just, one particular, maybe poignant example of a kind of larger, shift from a utopian to an anti-utopian, or something like that?
Can I answer by saying yes? I think you're right. It's a very good question. I think the shift is a historic shift, and anybody working on Eastern Europe would just recognise the kind of rhythm of what I'm saying. And it uses some fairly obvious markers around periodisation, 53, 56, so death of Stalin, and then 68. We all know this kind of periodisation, so that rhythm is pretty clear. But what I'm particularly interested in is how the body was imagined. And I think that this work does allow for thinking about the body in kind of different ways. I'm doing a little bit of work at the moment on the sort of the late 1950s and the sort of preoccupations that individuals have with walking. There's a lot of discussion of walking in Eastern Europe. It's kind of curious. And I'm going to make an argument in the work that I do that it's to do with a particular sensibility that takes hold, which is about reimagining the body after it had been ordered by Stalinism in particular ways. And I think there's a sort of connection here that the sort of human sensorium is being addressed in these works. They're about sound, they're about light, they're about colour, they're about movement very often. And I think that you can somehow gauge that with the body of work that I've shown you, even though we might find it elsewhere, but it's much more pronounced in these works because of the nature of the technologies and the media that are being used. I mean, I haven't really thought that through, but I think that's where I would go with an answer like that.
Do you have any other questions or comments?
I just think it's fantastic.
Well, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
And I will be seeing most of you, hopefully, and more of you tomorrow at the session at 10 a.m. that we have done with our 5 participants, and late in the afternoon with Guillermo Santamarina. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. It was great.